Okay, welcome back everyone. So for these last two sections, I'm going to go through them relatively quickly and just walk you through them in the textbook. I've highlighted some things that I'll talk about. Um, so basically, we're getting into acid-base balance, and then what happens if your body can't balance acid and base pH changes. There's a variety of systems in the body that permits blood and other bodily fluids to maintain a very specific and narrow pH range, even if they are facing situations in which that pH is being threatened. Uh, this is done through buffering, and a buffer in a chemical system is a chemical that prevents a radical change in pH by dampening the change in hydrogen ion concentrations in the case of excess acid or base. Most commonly, what you'll find is that the substance that absorbs the ions is either a weak acid itself, which will take up hydroxyl ions. By the way, hydroxyl ions are OH minus, or a weak base, which will take up hydrogen ions, H plus ions. And so keep that in mind. When you've got a weak base, you're going to take up things that are making you acidic. When you're a weak acid, you're going to take up things that are making it basic. So here's the pH scale, by the way. Just some things to point out. Check out hydrochloric acid at a 1 pH. That's pretty impressive for something that is biologically secreted. Battery acid and hydrofluoric acid are at 0. And then all the way down at 13 and 14, we've got bleach and liquid drain cleaner. At 7, we have pure water. I told you that urine is slightly acidic. It's at 6. By the way, what's our blood pH? Well, it's about 7.3 to 7.45. Anything slightly above or below that is considered acidosis or alkalosis. And changes, very small changes, like for instance going to like 7.8 pH, well, that can be fatal relatively quickly. And so we're really talking about very narrow ranges in which the pH of blood and other bodily fluids have to remain in order to survive. How do we do it? Well, there's a number of different systems that we're going to talk about, and they can change the pH in different amounts of times. It takes only seconds for the chemical buffers in the blood to make adjustments to the pH. Your respiratory tract could change, can adjust your blood pH upward, by the way. That means more basic, in minutes just by exhaling the CO2 from the body. And then we have the renal system, which can get rid of acidic urine and adjust blood pH through the excretion of those hydrogen ions. But that process, we know, can take up to hours and days to have an effect. And there's a number. What I'm trying to get out here is there's a number of different systems, and those systems can work at different times. And and depending on what is the problem, your body may or may not have enough time to sort it all out. Protein buffers are a good example of something that can buffer pH. You'll find that nearly all proteins can function as buffers. Proteins, by the way, are made up of amino acids. Amino acids contain positively charged amino groups and negatively charged carboxyl groups. And the charged regions of those molecules can bind hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions, and thus function as buffers. Buffering by proteins accounts for 2/3 of the buffering power of your blood and most of the buffering within cells. Well, how does the blood buffer? Well, how about that protein, hemoglobin? Hemoglobin, we know, is the protein that can transfer oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it also can buffer your blood pH. When you get conversion of CO2 into bicarbonate, you get a release of hydrogen ions, which would make your blood more acidic. But the hemoglobin can buffer those hydrogen ions by releasing oxygen, and oxygen and hydrogen go together to form water. And that helps maintain normal pH. Phosphate is also a good buffer. Phosphates are found in the blood in two forms: sodium dihydrogen phosphate it's a weak acid, and sodium monohydrogen phosphate, which is a weak base. When you get sodium monohydrogen phosphate, that's right here, it's a weak base, coming into contact with a strong acid like HCl, the base will pick up a hydrogen ion to form the weak acid sodium dihydrogen phosphate and sodium chloride, a salt. And so what happens when you have a weak acid as compared to a strong acids are going to release their hydrogen ions and change the pH of the solution very quickly, whereas weak acids will hold on to the ions and not change the pH as drastically. And then, on the other hand, if you get a strong base, we can take that sodium dihydrogen phosphate, which is a weak acid, and it can buffer a strong base by taking up those hydroxide ions, the OH minus group, and switch to this weak base, which, oh, wait, by the way, that's this sodium monohydrogen phosphate, which is switches it to a weak base, which will hold on to the ions, and water, which of course is completely neutral, and we excrete water all the time. How about bicarbonate? Well, the bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer works in a similar fashion to the phosphate buffers. When sodium bicarbonate, right here, sodium bicarbonate, comes into contact with HCl, which is a strong acid, carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, is formed, and NaCl. And then, on the other hand, when we get a strong base, we can take that carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, and it can switch back to bicarbonate, which obviously buffers, and water. Okay, how about respiratory rate and regulation of acid-base balance? So there are chemoreceptors in your body that primarily use carbon dioxide as a signal. Now, if you've got a lot of carbon dioxide in the blood, you're going to be in acidosis, okay? The pH of your blood is going down. If acidosis stimulates your brain and arterial receptors, what happens is your respiration rate increases so that you can exhale a lot of CO2. And your carbonic acid, by the way, will also go down, and the pH of your blood will increase. On the other hand, if you are in alkalosis, where your blood pH is high, that stimulates the receptors to decrease your respiration rate, which can then increase blood carbon dioxide, the carbonic acid, and decrease pH. And so that's how you can regulate your blood through breathing. Hypercapnia is an abnormally elevated blood level of carbon dioxide that occurs in any situation in which your respiratory functions are impaired through pneumonia, congestive heart failure, reduced breathing, which is called hypoventilation due to taking drugs, or being on alcohol, or just holding one's breath. By the way, if you hold your breath, you'll start to get that urge to breathe. That's because you're building up acidity in your blood. And so that's just one way in which you can sort of feel those receptors working. Hypocapnia is abnormally low blood levels of carbon dioxide. That occurs if you're doing any sort of hyperventilation for any sort of reason. Anyway, we've already sort of talked about that, so I'll move on. How does the renal system, the urinary system, regulate acid-base balance? It addresses the metabolic component of the buffering system. Whereas we just talked about the respiratory system controlling the blood levels of carbonic acid by controlling exhalation of CO2, your renal system controls the blood levels of bicarbonate. And this is a whole bunch of chemistry that I'm just not going to ask you to get into right now. Let's get into the last section of this chapter and just talking about what happens if your body can't control this acid-base balance. And like I said, normal blood, its pH is very narrow, 7.35 to 7.45. If you're below 7.35, that's acidosis. And if you get below 7 for a continued amount of time, that can be fatal. Acidosis has several symptoms: headache, confusion, lethargic, being easily fatigued. All those two are the same thing, basically. And then a person who has a blood pH above 7.45, that's called alkalosis. A pH above 7.8 is fatal. So below 7 and above 7.8, you're not in a good position. Those are very, very small changes. Some symptoms of alkalosis include cognitive impairment, which could progress to unconsciousness, tingling or numbness in the extremities, muscle twitches, spasm, nausea, vomiting, and both acidosis and alkalosis can be caused by either metabolic or respiratory disorders. Let's see. Metabolic alkalosis, primary bicarbonate excess. Metabolic alkalosis is the opposite of metabolic acidosis. It occurs when the blood is too alkaline, pH above 7.5, due to too much bicarbonate, called primary bicarbonate excess. And we've kind of already gone through that, but here's some reasons that you could get that. You could have too much bicarbonate in the blood, and if you're eating too much of it, you're eating too much citrate. Or a big one people actually don't realize you could do is overdosing on antacids if you have stomach acid reflux. Now, you'd have to take quite a bit of Tums in order for that to happen, but it is possible if you have some severe heartburn and you think, oh, the more I take, the quicker the pain will go away. So it is possible to overdose on it. And then you could have things like Cushing's disease, which is the chronic hypersecretion of this hormone called ACTH by your pituitary gland, and that can cause chronic metabolic alkalosis. Anyway, respiratory acidosis occurs when your blood is overly acidic due to an excess of CO2, which then turns into carbonic acid. Respiratory acidosis can result from anything that interferes with your respiration: pneumonia, emphysema, congestive heart failure, holding your breath, things like that. Respiratory alkalosis occurs when the blood is overly alkaline due to a deficiency in carbonic acid. And how does that happen? It's when you are exhaling too much CO2 from your lungs, which occurs from hyperventilation. Anything that can do that, like when you have an elevated respiratory rate because you're emotional, you're upset, you're scared, you've got a fever, it's hot outside, you can actually pass out. And surprisingly, another thing is aspirin overdose. Or salicylic acid toxicity can result in respiratory alkalosis as the body tries to compensate for initial acidosis. Although these compensatory mechanisms that we talked about usually work very well, when one of those mechanisms isn't working properly, like kidney failure or respiratory disease, they have their limits. And like I said, if we are not being able to fix these things in a short amount of time, they obviously can become fatal very quickly. The reason for this is we are made up of proteins, right? Proteins make up a lot of our structures, our enzymes, the ability to do the chemical reactions that we need to do to survive. Now, enzymes and proteins in general have very narrow ranges in which they can keep their shape, and of course shape and function are intimately entwined. And so if you change pH just a little bit, your proteins denature and lose their shape, and they are at some point too extensively damaged to continue doing what they need to do. That can disrupt your metabolic processes, obviously cause tissue damage, and ultimately death. That's all I'm going to talk about in today's lecture. That's the end of chapter 26. We have one more unit to get through in this class, and I'll see you in chapter 27.